Well, thanks so much, Roger, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. It's wonderful to see so many of you in 3 dimensions for the last 2 years. You've all been very flat. And this is actually the first time I've actually dared to step out and do anything in real time. So it's great to be at the RSM. It's one of my favorite London medical institutions. Many years ago, I used to spend all my time in its beautiful library. It is the best medical library in the world, without any question. And it's a very, very special place. Let me, first of all, thank David. How nice to see you. I saw you this morning, actually. I was watching you by computer, so. Yeah, very good entrance. You timed it brilliantly. Enter stage right. Let me thank Dr. Judy MacArthur-Clarke, Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Soulsby Foundation, for the kind invitation to join you. Any members of the Soulsby family who might be watching or here, thank you very much. It's a great honor. I remember Lord Soulsby very well. He didn't know me, but I remember seeing him around the RSM all those years ago. Thank you to the RSM's comparative medicine section, which I hope to convince you by the end of the next 35, 40 minutes or so, deserves to have a much more central place in the life and work of the RSM than perhaps it currently has. Now, the relationship between humans and animals is, of course, deep and ancient. And these relationships have only grown more complex over time. Today, what I'd like to do is to examine one aspect of our association with animals, an aspect that has provoked a controversy of momentous geopolitical importance. It's a story that is, perhaps, I would submit to you, the most urgent story facing the One Health community today. And that is, of course, the origins of SARS-CoV-2 and the pandemic of COVID-19 that it has precipitated. Writing in 2004, in the aftermath of the first SARS outbreak, which you heard David talk about this morning, beginning in Guangdong, moving to Hong Kong, Linda Safe, who was then working at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center, wrote this in one of the concluding documents, an analysis of what took place. At present, she wrote, we understand very little about coronaviruses or other viruses circulating in wildlife, or their potential to emerge or recombine with existing coronaviruses as public or animal health threats. And of course, 20 years on, the same is true today for SARS-CoV-2, except that the stakes are infinitely greater. It's important to know how this pandemic originated so that we can at least try to learn how to stop it or something similar from happening again. But the furor, and it has been a furor, about the origins of COVID-19 has brought on an international war of words. And that's what I'd like to reflect on a little bit this evening, as well as a genuine public health mystery. Now, for some critics, China stands in the court of public and political opinion as guilty of a monumental cover-up. The allegation, of course, is that SARS-CoV-2 was not a spillover event, a virus jumping from an animal host to humans, but rather it was either the result of an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where research on coronaviruses was taking place, or it was the deliberate release of a bioengineered virus. So let's briefly recount this story. It matters because the accusations against China have genuinely damaged the reputation and the credibility of the World Health Organization and its Director General, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, at a moment when we need a credible WHO and a credible Director General of WHO more than ever. The allegations against China have made that country and its scientific and political leadership something of a pariah on the world stage. And they've also contributed to first President Trump and now President Biden identifying China as the #1 threat to world peace. This whole discussion of the origins of COVID-19 has contributed to this massive destabilization in world order, in international security. Between the West and China, there has emerged a new Cold War. As Mark Honigsbaum, who is one of our foremost historians of pandemics, has written, and I quote, "If China is found to have played a part in the origins of COVID-19, it would amount to the crime of the century." The discipline that has the potential to literally walk the world back from the brink of this catastrophe is your discipline, One Health. So no pressure. Let me go back to the beginning of this very strange tale. The beginning for me, at least. January the 24th, 2020, we published a paper from a group of Chinese clinicians and researchers that described the first 41 patients with what we eventually came to call COVID-19. It set out the clinical description of the disease that we know only too well today. But importantly, it also identified that 27 of those 41 patients had been exposed to a very particular location in Wuhan, the Huanan seafood market. So what was the connection between that market and the disease? The very first fatal case that was reported in that paper was exposed to the market. His wife was not exposed, but she developed symptoms of COVID-19, and that fact suggested, although it didn't prove, but suggested person-to-person transmission. At the end of this clinical description, this case series, the authors pointed out that SARS-CoV-1 and MERS coronavirus were believed to have originated in bats. So quite reasonably, they asked, was SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 a zoonosis as well? But before that question could be answered seriously, of course, it rapidly became clear that politics would collide head-on with science. President Trump, remember him? He'll be back. Was quick to call SARS-CoV-2 the China virus. He claimed that he had seen definitive evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of the virus. He said that on the record at a White House press conference. And now, in response to this politically explosive situation, in February of last year, we published a letter. The letter was authored by Jeremy Farrar, director of the Wellcome Trust, Linda Safe, who I've already mentioned, Rita Colwell, who is a former director of the National Science Foundation, several leading scientists who spent their careers working on coronaviruses, and someone called Peter Daszak, who I will come back to on occasion throughout the next half an hour. That letter that we published on February the 18th, in the middle of this political firestorm about China's role in the origins of the pandemic, set out to praise the scientists and public health and medical professionals in China for their work, for their rapid identification of SARS-CoV-2, their response to the outbreak, and their willingness to share their data. This effort has been remarkable, they wrote. But they then went on to point out what they called rumors and misinformation about the origins of the virus that was now threatening opportunities for international cooperation, which we so desperately needed in the headwind of a pandemic. So they condemned what they called conspiracy theories, suggesting that COVID-19 did not have a natural origin. Instead, they argued that the overwhelming body of evidence suggested that SARS-CoV-2 was originating in wildlife, as they put it. Fatefully, they signed off their letter, "We declare no competing interests." But what very quickly became clear is that one author of that letter did indeed have an interest to declare. And it was an incendiary interest that lit the blue touch paper for some of the events that have taken place over the last year. It actually took 17 months for Peter Daszak to correct the record of that statement of no competing interest. In that declaration, he said that his salary was paid by a non-profit organization, which I noticed was somebody from that organization was the last speaker at this lecture, the EcoHealth Alliance. The mission of the EcoHealth Alliance is to develop science-based solutions to prevent pandemics and promote conservation. All very good. But the EcoHealth Alliance has indeed worked in China, funded by NIH and USAID, and indeed it has funded work that's taken place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That work that they had sponsored and had been involved in for some years involved studying the risks of viral spillover from animals to humans, and specifically the production of recombinant bat coronaviruses to study their entry into human cells. None of that was reported in the competing interest statement of the letter we published in February 2020. That February Lancet letter and the undisclosed competing interest, although the letter was written in good faith and for good reasons, provoked a strong counter-reaction, not only from the media, but also from the scientific community. In May, David Relman and others published a letter in Science arguing that there should be more investigation into the origins of the pandemic. They pointed out that a WHO inquiry that took place in the first half of this year concluded that a lab leak was, in their words, extremely unlikely. But they criticized the World Health Organization for not taking a lab leak more seriously. Only 4 out of over 300 pages of the WHO investigation final report were devoted to a lab leak. And they called for a more transparent, objective, independent investigation using all of the relevant research that was available to them. Meanwhile, of course, the news media loved this story. Not surprisingly, they were delighted to use the Relman letter as a way to make the case in favor of a lab leak. Ian Birrell at the Mail on Sunday was especially persistent, running double-page spreads every single week, almost for the past year, alleging malfeasance by the World Health Organization and supporting the view that a laboratory leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology had been suppressed by Peter Daszak, by Jeremy Farrar, and by The Lancet, that somehow we had conspired to suppress this crime of the century. The Mail on Sunday campaign, and we shouldn't dismiss the Mail on Sunday, it is the house organ of the current government. It is the highest selling Sunday newspaper in the country. It wields enormous power. The Mail on Sunday campaign was called China in the Dock. The Sunday Times then joined this conflagration. Its front page on May the 30th, 2021, ran a headline saying, "Wuhan lab leak is feasible, say British spies. Intelligence fears grow of Chinese cover-up." A Sunday Times editorial in that same issue said, "The lab leak theory is back in play." Its sister paper, The Times, followed suit, claiming in an editorial that the Chinese government needed to do much more to prove its innocence. They were guilty until proven innocent. Now let's just calm this rhetoric for a moment and just step back. It is fair to say that there is a perfectly legitimate line of inquiry to pursue here. In fact, Tony Fauci, who's done such a brilliant job in leading the US response under often very difficult political circumstances, Tony Fauci has called for greater transparency about the work that's taken place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And it's surely right to be concerned about the security of 59 Wuhan-like biosafety level 4 laboratories across 23 countries around the world. We shouldn't just give those laboratories a free pass and assume that everything is fine. But the attacks in the media have become increasingly personalized. In June of this year, the Mail on Sunday, you're going to hear a lot about them, the Mail on Sunday targeted Jeremy Farrar directly under the headline, "British head of Wellcome Trust is accused of a chilling bid to stifle debate around the lab leak theory." And under massive pressure, truly massive pressure, the World Health Organization seemed to walk back on the conclusions of its independent investigation. Director General Tedros argued that every hypothesis should be open. We should not close off the potential validity of a laboratory leak. At the G7 meeting in Cornwall in June this year, President Biden said that he remained undecided about the origins of the pandemic. And we have seen this mounting geopolitical tension that has led, of course, China's political leaders to double down on their innocence, denying the possibility of a laboratory leak, denying that so-called gain-of-function research took place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and dismissing all attempts by the international community to revisit the possibility of a lab leak. The Chinese government, it has to be said, didn't always help itself when making its case for its innocence. It invented the existence of a Swiss biologist who supposedly claimed, none of this was true, that the United States had pressured WHO to be more open to a laboratory leak. All fiction. But the animosity, which still is growing between the United States and Chinese governments, was dramatically intensifying during the course of this year. In August, Beijing officials demanded that Washington opened a public inquiry into a US military laboratory in Maryland, trying to push the blame for the origin of the pandemic onto the United States. And they continued to refuse the possibility of independent investigators coming to the country to investigate the Wuhan Institute. What had become clear by the summer of this year is that the debate about the origins of the pandemic was no longer about the science. It was all about the politics. In August, the United States intelligence services, not CDC, not NIH, not the National Academy of Medicine, but the US intelligence services issued their own report saying that, in their words, they were unable to reach a final conclusion about the lab leak theory. That report had been commissioned by President Biden when he had come into office in January. The best they could say was that SARS-CoV-2 had not been developed as a biological weapon by the Chinese government. Well, that was something, I suppose, but still a lot of uncertainty around what took place at the Wuhan Institute. China, not surprisingly, immediately responded by promising a counter-attack against the United States. Fu Kong, Director General of China's Foreign Ministry, said this: "Scapegoating China cannot whitewash the United States. If they want to basically accuse China, they had better be prepared to accept the counterattack from China." Now, it was scientists who then tried to step in to quieten the shouting. In September, Linda Saif, again, she's played many important parts over the past 2 years, wrote in The Lancet, "Endless arguments back and forth about the emergence of SARS-CoV-2, pitting evolution and spillover in nature against a laboratory leak, do little to advance our critical knowledge base." So true. They pointed out that this environment of recrimination with implicit or explicit blame placed on the Wuhan Institute and its scientists made it absolutely impossible to get anywhere near discovering the truth of what had taken place to initiate the pandemic. But then, of course, that triggered another group of scientists. And this is, unfortunately, another one of the lessons of the past 2 years. It hasn't only been the politicians who've engaged in somewhat ham-fisted combat. Scientists have too. And this second group of scientists wrote to us, arguing that those who supported a zoonosis had precipitated, in their words, a silencing effect on an important scientific debate. They argued that a laboratory leak was indeed plausible, not least because there was no concrete evidence, in their view, to support a natural origin. Now, for the past 18 months, Chinese scientists, wisely, given the politics, had remained silent, living, I would imagine, in something of a state of fear if they had spoken out. But 2 months ago, they did indeed break their silence. Chen Wang, the president of the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, together with scientists in Beijing and Wuhan, wrote to us to say that a laboratory leak was extremely unlikely, in their words. But note that phrase. They didn't say that they could rule it out completely. And they agreed that research and global health communities had yet to reach a clear conclusion about the origins of the pandemic. They agreed that viruses could indeed be made in laboratories, but they defended what they called the rigorous administrative and supervisory systems in place in their high-level biosafety labs. And they made a plea at the end of their letter, a really heartfelt, I know Chen Wang quite well, and I can hear this as a genuinely heartfelt plea, that SARS-CoV-2 is a common enemy of humankind, and so humankind must work together. Extensive international cooperation, he wrote, was the only way to solve this puzzle. But since October, when we published that piece from Chinese scientists, since October, allegations against not only China, but also Western governments have only escalated. Even Patrick Vallance, our chief scientific advisor, has been implicated in some kind of cover-up based on redacted emails obtained under a Freedom of Information request by, yep, you guessed it, the Mail on Sunday. And very recently, a new voice has entered this story. Matt Ridley, who will be known to you perhaps as a respected science writer, author of books such as The Red Queen, Genome, and The Rational Optimist. He's now the 5th Viscount Ridley and sits as a Conservative member of the House of Lords, an elected hereditary peer. That doesn't sound a contradiction in terms. He's a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and a one-time climate skeptic. In a book written and published literally just 2 weeks ago with Alina Chan called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, he explores these competing theories as to the origins of the pandemic. Now, Alina Chan is actually the more interesting co-author of this book. She's a postdoctoral scientist at the prestigious Broad Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And very early on in 2020, she raised the possibility of a lab origin for the pandemic in a preprint. She says now that she was surprised back then at the dismissal by many other scientists of any theory other than a viral spillover event. And her message is that this isn't just a China problem. This is a problem for the whole international community, because what took place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was actually an international collaboration. It involved American scientists as well as Chinese scientists. Its work was partly funded by the National Institutes of Health. So this isn't about it only placing the blame on China. Everybody involved in that work had to share responsibility for what took place there. But as she came close to completing her book over the summer, she decided that actually the evidence had significantly shifted. The balance of probability, she felt, had moved from equipoise, uncertainty about the lab leak, to now more decisively supporting a lab leak. Why was that? A grant application suddenly surfaced. A grant application from 2018 came to light for $14 million from the EcoHealth Alliance. That work was to take place in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the objective set out in this grant was to create new SARS-like viral genomes, including the addition of genetic material that could improve the coronavirus's ability to infect human cells. That was the smoking gun. Now, in fact, that grant application was rejected. So there was no smoking gun, she admits. But, she says, if it was a gun, it would be warm to the touch. Although she alleges there's no cast iron proof that this work took place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, she contends that we know the direction of travel of their research, and that should heighten our suspicion that something dangerous took place there. They write in their book, so you don't have to go and buy it. I will just read you the conclusion. These revelations show that all is still to play for, except this is not a game. The world now faces the strong possibility that scientific research intended to avert a pandemic instead started one. From the start, there had been an active campaign by Chinese scientists and government officials, aided and abetted by far too many scientists, scientific journal editors, and journalists in the West to prevent the world finding out what happened. Now, the World Health Organization has come in for special criticism. President Trump's attacks on the agency and its Director General, his decision, President Trump's that is, to defund WHO, and his claim that WHO was somehow responsible for the pandemic by not being tougher on China. All of these attacks unquestionably put the agency on the back foot. It has been a convenient punchbag, not just for the United States, but for many other Western governments who are looking to blame others to distract from their own slow responses, missteps, and outright mistakes. But I think, personally, that WHO has done its best with a very weak hand. The agency, remember, has no authority to force countries to submit to an independent investigation. It is a member state organization, frustratingly so, but it is what it is. It is a member state organization. Its headquarters, its secretariat, its director general can only take instructions from its member states. The best that WHO can do is to be a platform for a kind of technical or at best moral voice of reason. Now, WHO's first report into what took place in China that was published in March of this year suggested that there was an animal intermediary between bats and humans that was responsible for the spillover event that led to the pandemic. And the priority, WHO argued, was to follow the animals, beginning at the Huanan market. But WHO has been heavily criticized for that conclusion. The central charge is that they used this investigation as a veil, as an exercise in political diplomacy, not independent scientific inquiry. And WHO's credibility and its authority has, sad to say, continued to weaken since that report in March because of the onslaught of criticism. In August, the Sunday Times ran a powerful front page story. China, it said, the WHO and the power grab that fueled a pandemic. And the claim was that China had infiltrated the very center of the World Health Organization. Exhibit A was that its previous Director General, Margaret Chan, had been nominated by the Chinese government. It was a takeover by one member state that sowed the seeds of a disaster. Now, I think that criticism is entirely unreasonable and based on a complete misunderstanding of the agency's role. The group that the World Health Organization appointed to conduct this independent investigation into the origins of the pandemic was, in fact, only the first part of a sequence of inquiries, which I'll explain in a few moments. That first phase of the investigation took an explicitly One Health approach to its method. It looked into and tried to reconstruct the very early days of the pandemic. It mapped the products sold at the seafood market. It tested livestock, wildlife, pets, and zoo animals, looking for evidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection. The idea of a lab origin was explicitly not in the original terms of reference or mandate of this WHO committee. But the team soon realized when they were in China that the lab leak theory was too important to ignore. And so they raised it with Chinese colleagues. They spoke to the leadership of all 3 laboratories in Wuhan that were handling coronaviruses, and they included a lab leak in their final report as one of 4 possible pathways for the virus entering the human population. So in fact, the WHO appointed team put the possibility of a lab leak back on the table themselves for the international community to consider. Entirely the opposite of what WHO's critics were contending. And now, just in the last few days, over the last week, a new team has been appointed for phase 2 of WHO's investigation. It's called the Scientific Advisory Group for the Origins of Novel Pathogens. It includes 28 scientists selected from over 700 nominations. Peter Daszak was a member of the first phase team. He's no longer a member of the current team. The terms of reference make explicit that there will be, and I quote, an independent evaluation of all available scientific and technical findings on the origins of SARS-CoV-2. No cover-up. You won't be surprised that our friends at the Mail on Sunday have already branded these 28 scientists as discredited. But in truth, WHO has actually put together a team with extraordinary multidisciplinary expertise across animal biology to virology, genomics to biosafety, zoonosis to environmental risks. And now it needs to move quickly. The window of opportunity that we have for discovering significant evidence is closing fast. Many of the farms that were supplying live animals to cities across China, including Wuhan, are now closed and their animals cold. But the geopolitical context in which phase 2 of this investigation will continue is important to consider and can't be ignored, because tensions between the West and the government of China are literally at breaking point. And you know them. The plight of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, with allegations of mass sterilization, enslavement, and imprisonment. Repression of freedoms in Tibet. Military escalation over Taiwan. Hong Kong's national security law. Intimidation in the South China Sea. The encroachment of Chinese business interests in critical national infrastructure. China's promise to quadruple its nuclear capability to 1,000 warheads by 2030. Its cooperative approach with the Taliban. Suboptimal commitments at COP26, and most recently, the mysterious disappearance of tennis star Heng Shui. This charge sheet has persuaded Western countries to adopt confrontational policies of containment against China. President Biden has made China his #1 foreign policy priority. In the United Kingdom, we've signed up to something called AUKUS, an alliance between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines, all part of an attempt to construct a ring of security around China. The political wound that is COVID-19 has only heightened these concerns. So as the pandemic evolves from variant to variant, as deaths mount well above 5 million, the actual figure is closer to 12 million because not all countries are counting deaths effectively. And as the public is showing signs of mounting resistance, frustration, and fatigue, and understandably so, this is the political situation that we are currently facing. So where do we go from here? The lab leak theory will continue to thrive as long as the Chinese government refuses to allow an independent investigation of what took place in Wuhan. But very recent work, published just 10 days ago in science does support a central role for the Huanan market in the origin story of this pandemic. Michael Worraby, who works at the University of Arizona as part of a team who for some time has been trying to track down the earliest possible events in the story of the pandemic. And in his latest paper, he displays some Sherlock Holmes-like skills in sifting through the evidence that we have before us. The earliest known case cluster of COVID-19 had no connection with the seafood market. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean a viral spillover event is unlikely? No. Other presentations of this originally mysterious pneumonia did have such associations with the seafood market. Remember in that first Lancet paper, a third of cases had no links. So we have some with links, some with no links. So does this confusing evidence mean that we can't draw any reliable conclusions? Not at all, argues Michael Worraby. When you strip away what seem like these contradictions, you're left with some very simple but compelling facts. I quote, "There was a genuine preponderance of early COVID-19 cases associated with the Huanan market. It was an extraordinary preponderance. A cluster of cases of COVID-19 in Wuhan, in and around the same place, in a city with a population of 11 million. This is not likely to be by chance, and associated with a live animal market where some of the same animals were present that we know were implicated in the SARS outbreak of 2002-03. Michael Worraby also makes the important point that we shouldn't actually expect every single one of those early cases to be connected to the market. SARS-CoV-2 is highly transmissible, and being asymptomatic is not uncommon. And so very quickly you will get to a point where you will have symptomatic cases that don't have any direct connection with the market at all. He concludes that the index case of COVID-19 most likely was someone who did have contact with infected live animals at that seafood market, but who didn't require hospitalization. This story is as yet unfinished. But let's try in the last few minutes to try and draw some of these threads together into tentative conclusions. And I have 4 tentative conclusions, not so tentative actually. First, this extraordinary conflict over the origins of SARS-CoV-2 shows why we need to, in Worraby's words, blanket the globe with a highly functional pneumonia of unknown etiology early warning system. Strengthening these systems of surveillance, of validation, alerts, all based on full transparency by all parties, using digital tools to connect laboratories around the world. That was one of the core recommendations of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, chaired by Helen Clark and Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, published in May this year. And last week, the panel published its 6-month progress report. It praised WHO's creation of a hub for pandemic and epidemic intelligence in Berlin, and that certainly is a good start. But there is an incredibly long way to go to strengthen surveillance capacities in countries. Develop mechanisms for linking signals that are picked up in different countries and translating those into efficient and effective responses. And COVID-19 is actually a perfect example of the challenge that this global surveillance system presents us. SARS-CoV-2 was likely circulating in China and Hubei province, where Wuhan is, at low levels back in October, November 2019. but its prevalence was just too low to be picked up to allow for its identification. But by the time that you had patients being admitted to hospital and identifying the virus that caused COVID-19, it was then too late. The virus had become firmly established in human communities, and it was impossible to turn history back. Now, today is actually day one of a special session of the World Health Assembly to consider whether a convention or a treaty could be put in place to strengthen these global surveillance efforts, to get the world to properly act together in a coordinated way, in a way they haven't done for the past 2 years, to address the risks of a pandemic. A great deal hangs on its outcome. And given the failures of the past 2 years, I can't be confident that we will have a positive outcome from those deliberations, sadly. A second conclusion. This debate about the origins of COVID-19 has been extraordinarily divisive, and it has harmed conditions for trusted cooperation between nations and between scientists. And yet, a productive environment for collaboration is an absolutely essential prerequisite to respond to the threat of a pandemic. And the confrontational approaches that we've seen, not only politicians, but also amongst some scientists, has poisoned the atmosphere for cooperation. It's hard to be a friend of China when you look at the long list of charges against the government, which I've set out. But without wishing to diminish any of those concerns, if we are going to be committed to our shared health security, it needs the full and welcome participation and engagement of Chinese medical and medical research communities with their international colleagues, not confronting them, accusing them, and blaming them. This is not the moment to vilify China over the origins of COVID-19. This is the moment to strengthen our solidarity with China in the face of a common global threat. A third conclusion, the debate over a lab leak has had one very positive outcome. It has shone a spotlight on laboratories that are authorized to deal with some of the world's most dangerous pathogens. I mentioned 59 such biosafety level 4 laboratories earlier in my talk, 25 in Europe, 14 in North America, 13 in Asia, 4 in Australia, and 3 in Africa. And there needs to be an urgent provision for an independent inspection mechanism for those BSL-4 laboratories. Only a quarter of countries with BSL-4 laboratories receive high scores for their biosafety and biosecurity. Only 40% of countries with BSL-4 laboratories are members of the International Experts Group on Biosafety and Biosecurity Regulators, where best practices are shared. There is a great deal of room for improvement. Last, let's come back to One Health, the whole purpose of this evening. SARS-CoV-2 was the product of ecological conditions that we, our species, created. Our numbers, our density, our connectivity, and specifically our interaction with animals. And the intensity of that interaction, of course, is only increasing, thanks partly to climate change, worsening the scarcity of resources, forcing people and animals to share increasingly crowded spaces. We need to focus on legal reforms, changing consumer attitudes, strengthening awareness amongst the public about the importance of One Health as a necessary response to COVID-19. Just as we have witnessed an environmental turn in our approach to health, thanks to the understanding of the climate crisis on health, so we need to see an ecological turn as one of the critical lessons of this pandemic. But as yet, I don't see anyone recognizing the importance of that ecological turn as part of future pandemic preparedness. And yet the study of living organisms in interaction with one another and with their surroundings will be absolutely central, foundational to that pandemic preparedness. And here the traditional attitudes of my own discipline, medicine, are not well suited to the task at hand. We study the human species and its diseases, but we don't study the relations of our species with other species. Arne Næss, who some of you may have heard of, was a Norwegian philosopher who died in 2009, aged 96. And he coined a term called deep ecology to represent the view of the biosphere that emphasized the intrinsic value of not only human, but also non-human life. It is a deep ecological turn that we need today, urgently. I don't mind whether we call it One Health or planetary health, it doesn't matter. But it certainly demands a radical transformation in our conception of health, habitat, and humanity. Thank you very much.